Hi, welcome to a new episode of Let's Talk SE. I'm Carlo Furia. It's my great pleasure to have Patrice Godefroid from Microsoft Research with us today. So much of Patrice's research has had a quite significant impact not only to the research of other people in academia, but also on the products of the development division at Microsoft. So in a more general context, how would you define and measure impact in software engineering research?
I mean, the good news is that there are many ways to have impact, and the bad news is that it's very hard to measure sometimes impact. So, like one can point to a specific project to have some impact, but the impact then, I mean, at least of the measurement is usually like very narrow, like niche applications or basically specific groups using this type of technology, new programming languages or ways for testing or program analysis and things like that. But that then if you want to measure precisely, it's much more, the scope of the measurement is usually much more restricted. And so, is it easier to have an impact while working, for instance, in an industrial research lab than in academia? Yes and no. I mean, by definition, I mean, if you are doing research in an industrial lab, you're supposed to have somewhat of an impact internally in the parent company, and you have access to more problems and more direct contact, etc. So, but you can also have a lot of impact doing more longer-term research. And typically, I mean, actually, that's another question. I mean, these days, is long-term research more done in industry or in academia? In principle, it should be done in academia. But sometimes one wonders. But it's possible also to have a big impact doing research anywhere, I think. And also, it's also possible to have a lot of impact on software engineering without doing research in software engineering. I mean, by just look at how, through like startups, etc. I mean, the program tools and environment of tomorrow. Sometimes they are not, or often actually, they are not designed or developed in research cycles, basically. I mean, and so the market is driving a lot of that too.
Another feature of Patrice's research is that, especially his recent work on testing, has combined different techniques and practices that were initially developed independently. For example, I'm thinking of a combination of a certain usage of constraint solving with state space exploration techniques that come from like model checking approaches. So this convergence of techniques seems to be an emerging trend in verification research. So regarding this, what do you think are the implications of this trend on the traditional separation onto the research communities?
Yes, this trend started a long time ago. I mean, like 10 years ago, or like for instance, for software model checking. I mean, 15 years ago, where and now more recently also the resurgence, so to speak, of automated theory proving, at least used by program analysis and like for verification, etc. So. So indeed, there are many more connections between the different communities which is much smaller and more isolated, let's say 15 years ago than they are today. And in a way, I mean, this is great. There are more interconnection, more people talking to each other. The bad news is it's very confusing. I mean, you have to go to so many conferences to keep everything, basically. I mean, it's much more kind of an explosion there of work and communities, perhaps sometimes a little bit losing not their focus, but a bit their identity in the sense that, if you have a good paper these days on like some program analysis merging, like testing, verification, theory proving, static program analysis, there are many top conferences you can pick, basically. And so it's not like, it's a little bit, it's a very diverse world, but in practice, I mean, we should talk to each other and use whatever we can to try to combine the best of multiple views and tools and techniques and be pragmatic. And that's also part of how you often is by having kind of significant advances, is by having kind of more multidisciplinary approach and combining really advances in different fields. That's how one gets it's a trick to get big advances. So I think this is great.
Another point about Patrice's career is that he was mostly in corporate research labs. So now he's at Microsoft Research and previously spent several years at Bell Labs. So can you compare the essential features of how research is done in these two institutions, so Bell Labs and Microsoft Research?
There are some cultural differences, and also due to the parent company. Microsoft is very different from like AT&T or Lucent Technology. But there is one thing which is an ambition to try to be basically the best lab in the world in its own field, etc. And so that's what I like. I mean, trying to have that have ambitious goals and there are fun working environment with lots of interesting colleagues and very interesting problems also, and good connection with the product groups, etc. So these are both very stimulating places to do research. One has both places. One has a lot of freedom to do whatever one wants, and with the constraint of an industrial lab and fewer students, etc. And perhaps some less freedom in some respects, basically, but still a lot of freedom, and so much freedom that sometimes also compared to academia, we have less, perhaps actually short-term pressure, like to publish, for instance, than in academia, which make it easier sometimes to look a little bit further, I think. But these are both great places to work.
If you started your PhD right now, given all your knowledge, so what would you be working on? What would be which topic would you pick?
That's a tough.
You can also say the same thing you're doing right now.
I cannot do the same thing, because now the problems that we're working on 20 years ago when I did my PhD, there's so much progress that has been made, so the problem is not open. So it's easier to pick a problem area which is fairly open than a very established field. It's much harder to contribute significantly. It's just easier just to be first, so to speak, versus to be best or better, especially when there are so many people, talented people that looked at the problem before. So I will try to pick basically a research area which is relatively new. And I'll leave it at that, because you could take an established research area, like software engineering, but then carve out some new specific area. So there's still a lot of things to be done. So I don't want to be too explicit here. So, but definitely pick basically a new research area, whatever that means, and also pick a good advisor that's very good advisor.
This was Carlo Furi interviewing Patrice Godefroid for Let's Talk SE.